Has the time finally come for another mainline Zelda game to step outside the Kingdom of Hyrule and explore far-flung and exciting new places? With Tears of the Kingdom reusing the same map as Breath of the Wild, the producers have already confirmed that the next game will be set in a new map. But how new is new? Are we talking another reinvention of the world of Hyrule, or something shockingly different? Although I touched on this in a previous video several months ago, I think the topic deserves a thorough deep dive, so let's have a look at the likelihood of Link stepping outside the bounds of traditional Hyrule for a new adventure. Incidentally, if you enjoy Nintendo Forecast videos, please consider checking out the channel's new Patreon, which I will link in the show notes below. Okay, so thinking about Hyrule, I think our starting point needs to be Zelda Echoes of Wisdom. My first draft of this video was ready to go before Echoes of Wisdom was actually announced, and so this section is added on latterly, but I think it's important to reflect on what this game announcement tells us. While it's not entirely clear to what extent Echoes of Wisdom reuses past Zelda maps, analysis by the great and good of Zelda YouTube seems to confirm that the map is broadly consistent, but not identical, to the A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds maps. The second consecutive game, and if you count multiplayer Zelda as its own concern, the third Zelda title in the last four, to develop from a map that has substantial similarities to the map of a previous game. Tears of the Kingdom and A Link Between Worlds being the last two games to do this. Now, this does not have to be a problem. Echoes of Wisdom and Tears of the Kingdom seem to have a commonality in that they are driven not by exploring brand new worlds, but in utilising new and unique mechanics to aid traversal and to give a sense of freedom. It's not that exploring new worlds isn't a part of the Zelda formula that works and is loved, it's just that these two titles seem to be looking to scratch a different itch. And to be honest, that makes sense for two games released late on in the life of her system. Breath of the Wild's map was so vast that adapting it for Tears of the Kingdom was a logical move, and with Echoes of Wisdom changing the lead character and a core mechanic, it benefits from the ability to keep some elements consistent. Sometimes the 2D games are used to trial mechanics for the main games, as we saw with the option to tackle dungeons in any order from A Link Between Worlds, which was first experimented with in 2D before being fully implemented with Breath of the Wild's fully open-air gameplay. But while there may be some features of Echoes of Wisdom which give hints of future directions for the franchise, I don't think the presence of a rather classic Hyrule needs to be one of them. We know for a fact that the next game will have a different map because they have said that they're going to not reuse the same map again next time. Moreover, the presence of Zelda as a major character makes sense for a classical Hyrule map to be used. Zelda is about wisdom and she is deeply connected to the land of Hyrule. Link, though, represents courage, and so exploration and sometimes venturing beyond the bounds of the realm makes more sense for him and his specific character. In a game where you play as Zelda, it just makes sense to explore Hyrule first. Does that mean future 2D Zeldas will be chiefly set in Hyrule too? I don't think so, given the way that games tend to react against the titles before them, and there are only so many ways you can configure the world in 2D without it still being recognisably Hyrule, which means that they will probably need to do something a little bit different if they do another 2D title anytime soon. So, let's now turn to look at the 3D types of games and whether Hyrule will continue to be a major feature of mainline Zelda going forward. The first thing we have to wrestle with is, do the team even know where the game they're currently working on will ultimately be set? What I mean by this is that the Nintendo development teams do not do the very Western strategy of designing a full and rich and detailed world and then figuring out how to build gameplay to match. Rather, they will spend months or years crafting a brilliant gameplay experience and then skin it with the appropriate world and story that fits the kind of game they've built. Clearly, with Tears of the Kingdom, they knew in advance that they had the Hyrule of Breath of the Wild to tinker with and expand from, and they know they won't have that in reserve next time, but they certainly will have some kind of world. In certain cases, they need to know a little bit about the world ahead of time. The sky mechanics in Skyward Sword and the Great Sea in Wind Waker already necessitated certain gameplay elements, and it will be difficult to develop these games without knowing at least a little bit about the kind of world they were building, although apart from the sky sections, the Skyward Sword levels are mostly linear experiences that could probably have been seen in most Zelda titles with minimal adaptation. Furthermore, the Wind Waker mechanics could have been applied to a wide variety of different types of ocean landscape. The backstory of this being a flooded version of the same kingdom we've been so familiar with was possibly a late development, or at least it has the potential to have been. It could easily have been an adventure just set somewhere across the ocean, but still in the same world, just like Link's Awakening was. For this reason, I kind of doubt there is anyone alive right now who knows exactly where the next game will be set, simply because it's so early in the development of the new title, and these details may not yet be specified in any meaningful way. Still, the team does design its games partly in response to the previous titles. Sometimes this is driven by what they want to swing away from, and these can be quite big swings. While Majora's Mask was dark and claustrophobic, Wind Waker was bright and open and expansive, and to contrast with the anime-style Wind Waker look, they tilted to a much more mature take of the world with Twilight Princess. Similarly, while Skyward Sword was about as linear as it's possible for a Zelda game to be, Breath of the Wild was gloriously open to the point where some were concerned it could barely sequence elements required in order to form a coherent narrative. Sometimes, though, it's not what they're responding to that is crucial, but what they're building from. Twilight Princess played around with Wii motion mechanics, but this was clearly something they wanted to develop further, and while perhaps Skyward Sword didn't fully land the mechanic, it's not difficult to imagine why they considered it a gameplay style with such huge potential. Here's the Kingdom again, built from, rather than reacted against, its predecessor, expanding the sense of freedom and the possibilities of play in ways undreamt of in any prior iteration of Hyrule, although even then, there is the sense that they at least tried to incorporate a more intricate story and more traditional temples, though clearly in the eyes of many players, they did not go far enough in either direction. I think it's notable that the games which were the second iterations on a system, Skyward Sword and Tears of the Kingdom, tended to reuse past technologies, while the games that launched with new technologies, or at least, as with Twilight Princess, received simultaneous releases, were a little more cautious and perhaps did not want to give up on the large amount of coding already done for the same system in order to really shake the foundations. But the next game will not just be for a new system, but very probably for the later years of the new system. I wouldn't expect a new Zelda until 2028 or 2029 at the absolute earliest, but nobody ever got poor betting on Zelda titles being delayed, so 2030 or beyond are far from unreasonable possibilities, especially as the developers seem to have taken the approach of cutting off the world of the Wild at its knees and not continuing it through DLC or even through much of a post-launch advertising campaign. It will start to feel very distant by the time the next game rolls around, even if, as seems likely, there are up-resed versions available around the launch of the new system. What this means is that there is space to explore Hyrule as new, and for it to potentially feel quite different. Previously, new iterations of Hyrule have generally fallen into two categories. There are the adapted forms of Hyrule, which, to all intents and purposes, are new locations. Skyward Sword Hyrule or Wind Waker Hyrule are the two great examples of these, with the sky and sea dominating the exploratory portions of the game and quickly becoming the most memorable aspects of the map. I think it's a little tricky to imagine them going back to this in the next title though. After all, both of those titles subscribe to the general Ocarina of Time template, and that was very much grounded in the original 2D games, and most especially A Link to the Past. Breath of the Wild, on the other hand, opened up the map to such a vast extent that it will be difficult to disguise the Hyrulean elements. Breath of the Wild went down the route, of course, of making the world in ruins, and it's possible to imagine that they could go back and do Hyrule at its height, something we have not seen for a very long time. Certainly, I think fans will be excited for that, and if the game follows from or coincides with a Legend of Zelda feature film, that makes all the more sense. After all, the great and glittering world of Hyrule at its height would be an impressive and immersive experience, and my guess is that a new film would rather choose that as its setting than something closer to the ruined world of Breath of the Wild or Wind Waker. But there are practical implications. For one thing, it would involve a vast time investment on the part of the development staff to create NPCs and huge locations so that the scale of the city was commensurate to the scale of the game. After all, it would be pointless doing Hyrule Castle if it felt not much different in scale than, say, Lookout Landing. Also, while I do think there will be some pressure to show a full-fledged Hyrule before too long, it's also not necessarily the case that Nintendo needs the next title to scratch that itch. After all, Nintendo give their teams, and especially the mighty Zelda team, a phenomenal amount of latitude, and I would expect this to extend most certainly to the aesthetics of the worlds that they're creating. But more practically, there are other games which can adequately show the world of Hyrule at its height. In particular, both A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time must be overdue reinventions to bring them to the newest generation, and it's tricky to imagine a better take on an iconic Zelda landscape than Ocarina of Time. In this case, I think the Zelda team would have the impetus and scope to, let's say, do a more sci-fi modern version of Hyrule. The difference between this game and the prior ones would be stark enough that nobody would much mind coming across Faron Woods or Zora's Domain again, because inevitably they would appear so different through the prism of the new design aesthetic, and there is always a certain fascination with seeing those old locations rendered in new and different forms. But that is an extreme possibility for how they might adapt the land of Hyrule, albeit influenced by some of the development art in the Breath of the Wild art book. I wonder just how many really radical changes are possible without it eventually reverting back to feeling like the traditional land all over again. How many times can you really do the Lost Woods and make it feel like they're different from what's come before? And how much does it matter? The difficulty though is that there are only so many types of biomes you can really develop, and at a certain point you might wonder, what's the point of making the world different from Hyrule? If there's a spooky wood, why is it not the Lost Woods except for stubbornness and trying to cling to a fig leaf of difference? If there's an underwater kingdom, well, why not make it Zora's Kingdom, which after all has looked so different in different games that it can basically stand a near endless degree of reinvention around its core theme. It's really incumbent on the developers to actually create new settings that feel different right from their core experience, and not just try to present a world that is Hyrule in all but name. Before you know it, it will be very easy to create a map which feels, to all intents and purposes, identical in content to what came before. And at this point, why do you not just go the whole hog and just name it Hyrule? I think there is a case against this though. The Oracle's titles and Link's Awakening both managed to use some traditional locations, but at least notionally were exploring new lands and just saying, look, it's different, and this did give it a very different feeling. Mainline Zelda games for years have had this strange sense of nostalgia built in as you rediscover familiar elements in these newly designed lands, but one thing I think they're likely to react against after Tears of the Kingdom is exactly this kind of backwards-looking approach. If the developers go for a theme of newness and surprise, which feels completely appropriate after a game that is literally reconstituted from the game before, then it would make sense to set it in a land with a history that is unknown to players and characters, and to give the game a true sense of exploration of the new and surprising. With Monolith Soft supporting them, I am sure they can give imaginative and weird twists on traditional biomes and vistas. In a sense, every game has the same problem, that there are only so many locations you can truly explore, but if there's a strong narrative driving you forward to explore, and startling and stunning new vistas and locations to discover, it could certainly feel like you're exploring a new world, as opposed to the same old world reconstituted. And personally, I would love to see the absolute wackiness of Majora or Link's Awakening back again, another game that doesn't just break the gaming conventions of Zelda series, but breaks the narrative conventions as well. All things considered, I think the odds remain firmly in the camp that we will get another version of Hyrule to some degree. After all, you have to go back to Majora's Mask to find a console mainline Zelda that doesn't stick to the land of Hyrule, and that was a quick follow-up to Ocarina, which was very much a Hyrule-centric title. The next game will be a huge graphical uptake, and the most traditional takes on Hyrule, The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time, and Twilight Princess, have generally coincided with a technology bump, as the team can now apply ideas that they simply couldn't have previously. I will say as a note of caution though that given the increased scale of the map, they will need a lot more ideas to make this world of Hyrule feel different. I can't seem to get any larger than the Breath of the Wild map, because they modelled that deliberately on Kyoto in terms of size and area, and I feel like they'll want to keep that rough and ready rule of thumb. Still, there is always scope to twist Hyrule in some new and surprising fashions. Sometimes forecasting is looking not at what you want in the moment, but the overall likelihood though, and Therefore, I would say that there is a 70% chance that the next title will take place, in whole or insignificant part, in some form of Hyrule. Although personally, I would love to see a game which is completely outside the bounds of anything that we've seen before. But what do you think? Do you want to see them stick with the tried and true, or roll the dice on a strange new world? Let me know in the comments, and you might want to check out this video on screen right now for more explorations of the future trajectory of The Legend of Zelda. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.